A sharp wind rattles the lead-framed windows of St. James's Palace on the gray October morning of 1760, as 22-year-old Prince George, head bowed beneath a plain riding cloak still dusted with road grime, paces the corridor outside his grandfather's bedchamber. A door creaks open. The royal physicians appear, faces hard as stone. No words need be spoken. In a heartbeat, the quiet, thoughtful prince who signs his letters merely Gr. must now shoulder the crown of the world's mightiest maritime empire, an empire already locked in a globe-spanning war, an empire whose parliament whispers of fortune and frustration in equal measure, an empire whose very definition of freedom is about to fracture across 8 tempestuous time zones. What George cannot yet know is that his name will travel on pamphlets and battle flags, on the lips of rebels and redcoats alike, and, eventually, in the clinical dossiers of bewildered physicians charting a monarch's tortured mind. He was born in London on June 4, 1738, in a modest townhouse that quivered each night to the rumble of sedan chairs and the boisterous laughter of Georgian revelers. Unlike his father Frederick, cold, unpredictable, and German to the marrow, young George was baptized in English, schooled in Shakespeare, and taught to consider the Thames his local stream, not the Lena of distant Hanover. To the public, he seemed a reassuring compromise. Hanoverian blood, British soul. Yet destiny would not let him linger in the quiet provinces of princely adolescence. In 1751, his father dropped dead of a burst abscess, and the crown's dazzling burden slid one rung down the family tree. At 12, George tasted the metallic tang of irreversible fate. Fast forward a turbulent decade. The 7 Years' War rages across continents, from the muggy cane fields of Guadeloupe to the frozen forests of the St. Lawrence River. Lawrence, turning Europe's dynasties into feverish gamblers. Britain's coffers are hemorrhaging gold. Its generals toast victories at Quebec, while creditors gnash their teeth in Threadneedle Street. When George ascends the throne, skeptics murmur that the boy lacks political teeth, that real power will default to the blustering titans of the Whig aristocracy. Instead, the new king performs a political pirouette few expected. He plucks John Stuart, the 3rd Earl of Bute, Scottish, soft-spoken, and decisively not the done thing, from relative obscurity, and makes him First Minister. London's coffee houses explode in outrage. Satirists sketch Bute dangling the crown like a trinket on a tartan ribbon. Stock jobbers scream that Jacobites lurk behind every oak panel in Whitehall. George's honeymoon with public opinion barely lasts longer than the scent of new varnish on his coronation coach. On a warm night in March 1751, Frederick complained of a tightness behind his ribs, waved off the court physicians with a shrug, coughed once, and collapsed dead of a burst lung abscess. George, aged 12, became heir apparent with all of London watching to see whether the boy would crack like green wood under the weight. He did not. Instead, he buried himself in books on constitutional law, Newtonian physics, and, scandalously, Thomas Sydenham's essays on smallpox inoculation. He played the harpsichord until his fingers blistered, sketched architectural elevations of imaginary palaces, and starved his hunting hawk himself because servants never bled the larks correctly. Even his detractors admitted, half grudgingly, that the lad possessed that quiet yet unnerving Hanoverian discipline, coffee at 6, fencing at 8, Euclid at 9, that could freeze the marrow of lazier courtiers. By the late 1750s, Europe was ablaze. The 7 Years' War, that sprawling, sulphurous quarrel over dynastic honor, trade routes, and the meaning of empire itself, ripped across 3 continents. British troops traded bayonet thrusts with French Marines amid Aleutian blizzards. English frigates chased Spanish galleons through phosphorescent Caribbean midnight. The national debt ballooned from £74 million to almost double that figure, and chandlers near Docklands could scarcely pour enough tallow to keep the Admiralty's map rooms lit around the clock. Politics at Westminster smelled perpetually of hot metal and cordite. Whig grandee William Pitt the Elder demanded more ships, more men, more money, while country gentlemen grumbled that every new guinea extracted from the taxpayer sounded less like the ring of gold and more like the clink of imperial shackles. It is into that blazing crucible that George III steps the morning of his accession, October 25th, 1760. One of his first acts, equal parts gratitude and strategy, is to pluck John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Bute, from the relative obscurity of the royal household and elevate him to chief adviser. Bute, tall, owlish, possessed of an accent the London stage lampooned as Scot to the bone, had tutored George in botany and moral philosophy. Now he was to tutor him in the blood sport of British politics. The London press erupted. In caricatures, Bute appeared stitched into a bagpipe with 8 broomstick legs, draining English coins into a Caledonian sporran. Whig pamphleteers thundered that a Jacobite cabal was gearing up to unwrite the glorious revolution. Coffeehouse gossips claimed Bute had installed Scottish footmen in every palace passage to spy on the English. Every whisper set Georgian's nerves jangling. Yet the king, for once in total harmony with his own stubborn streak, would not budge. He wanted an end to an expensive war, an end to endless factional brawls, and an adviser he trusted not to surrender an inch of royal dignity to the smoke-wreathed bullies of St. Stephen's Chapel. But even iron-willed kings harbor private longings, and George's was, astonishingly for his era, domestic bliss. Conscious that the Hanoverians had already produced more than one public marital fiasco, he studied Europe's princesses the way a curio collector studies porcelain: angle of chin, rumor of temperament, potential for unwanted diplomatic baggage. His eye settled on Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, plump-cheeked, musically gifted, politically neutral, and, crucially, Protestant. On September 8, 1761, Charlotte's carriage clattered into the courtyard of St. James's at midday. She alighted seasick, homesick, and terrified, having learned her first English phrases, "Pray to God," and "Queen of Great Britain," somewhere between Rotterdam and the mouth of the Thames. George greeted her with a solemn bow, and, in German, promised to cherish her with all the tenderness which his heart and his religion required. 6 hours later, beneath a canopy embroidered with 200,000 seed pearls, the Archbishop of Canterbury pronounced them man and wife. An orchestra thundered Handel's "Let Thy Hand Be Strengthened," and half of London, perched on rooftops and tavern scaffolds, roared until their throats split. The whispers began before the cathedral incense cleared. She was plain. She was provincial. She had never seen an opera in her life. How could such a mouse stand up to the diamond-encrusted intrigue of English court society? But the gossips underestimated Mecklenburg's steel. Within weeks, Charlotte had memorized enough idiomatic English to banter with the Duchess of Northumberland about the relative merits of Newcastle versus Bathwater. Within months, she had commissioned a greenhouse at Kew to cultivate 40 different varieties of pineapple. Within years, she was presiding over a nursery that, by 1770, included 10 healthy children. George soon found himself scurrying from Privy Council meetings to rock cradles and read German fairy tales. His fingers sometimes stained with Windsor soil because he'd been out in the North Meadow lecturing his steward about nitrogen-rich clover. When society wits derided him as Farmer George, he grinned and informed them that sustainable crop rotation would feed more soldiers than any empty toast to Britannia's glory. Still, hayseed kings rarely manage empires by hoe and hymn book alone. On the other side of the Atlantic, 13 colonies stretched from frost-bitten Maine to mosquito-haunted Georgia, flush with self-confidence after helping George's armies beat the French out of Canada and the Ohio Valley. They were also flush with debt. The war's costs had to be repaid, and London reasoned, somewhat logically, disastrously tactlessly, that colonial taxpayers should shoulder their imperial share. Thus the Sugar Act of 1764, trimming molasses duties, but enforcing them with new vigor. Thus the Stamp Act of 1765, mandating revenue stamps on everything from playing cards to spiritual almanacs. Colonial printers filled their broadsheets with black-bordered skull and crossbones in place of the royal stamp. Virginian Patrick Henry thundered that Caesar had his Brutus, Charles the Thorough his Cromwell, and George III might profit by the example. The House of Burgesses gasped. Henry apologized for any treasonous implication, sort of, and London ignored the gathering storm. 2,000 miles of choppy Atlantic and at least 4 weeks of sailing separated king from colonist. That distance bred illusions on both sides. George imagined the average New England farmer still toasted his health by candlelight. The average New England farmer imagined George as a red-cloaked caricature conjured by distant ministers. When Parliament, harried by boycotts, repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, colonists danced around liberty poles, but their relief lasted less than a year. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, clever, smirking, and desperate for revenue, slapped new duties on glass, paper, and tea. London merchants were delighted. Boston merchants unsheathed their pens. Pamphlets like Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer and John Dickinson's irrepressible essays insisted that no taxation without representation was not a slogan but a natural law axiom. Parliament reopened 1768 with half its benches full of MPs furious that their authority was being questioned by rye farmers, and the other half terrified that a profitable trade system was about to go kablooey. George watched, scribbling notes in the margins of dispatches from the colonial secretary. Fair. Too harsh. Why not compromise? He knew enough constitutional history to understand that once parliaments cave to mobs, they rarely claw back the initiative. But he also knew that English liberty was built on the principle of consent. On one cold November evening, he summoned Bute's successor, Lord North, moon-faced, plodding, disarmingly witty, into a lamp-lit closet off the privy chamber and demanded a plan that was neither humiliating climb-down nor bloodthirsty crackdown. North suggested suspending most of the Townshend duties, except for tea, a face-saving fig leaf. George agreed. Too little, too late. In 1770, 5 colonists died beneath musket fire in King Street, a scuffle the Americans christened the Boston Massacre, a misnomer that traveled faster than any herd of facts. Paul Revere's engraving showed redcoats grinning as they fired. That image, reproduced thousands of times, etched itself into colonial memory like acid. Tension waxed and waned until December 16, 1773, when 50 men disguised as Mohawk warriors rowed out to 3 East India Company vessels and dumped 342 chests of tea, worth almost 10,000 pounds, into Boston Harbor, while a winter moon silvered the bobbing crates. When word reached London, backbenchers shouted for the rope. Moderates pleaded for overtures. George, jaw clenched, signed the Boston Port Act on March 31, 1774, sealing the harbor until indemnity was paid. Far away in hills above Charlotte, North Carolina, a group of Scots-Irish farmers read the act in astonishment and concluded a king who would starve an entire town for political theater could starve any subject anywhere. They began drilling in the meadows behind their clapboard churches. Imagine Whitehall on a January afternoon in 1775. Snowflakes swirl along the courtyard. George III paces the crimson-carpeted council chamber. Lord Dartmouth urges conciliation. Lord George Germain demands a show of force. The Duke of Grafton scribbles odds of rebellion versus surrender, like a man at a horse auction. Outside, clerks shuffle bundles of colonial correspondence bound in red tape. In the midst of the cacophony, the king stands rooted before a marble fireplace, eyes fixed on a map. Massachusetts here, Carolinas here, a country the width of half Europe held together by shipping lanes and loosely shared ancestry. He quietly observes that an empire cannot survive if its beating heart appears arbitrary. Yet his next words, the clerk notes, are harder than marble. The colonies must submit or triumph will render them more dangerous still. Posters soon appear in New Jersey depicting George as Nero fiddling over burning liberties. Spring brings gunpowder. On April 19, 1775, redcoats marching to confiscate colonial stores at Concord find themselves peppered by militia behind stone walls. 8 Americans die on Lexington Green. By nightfall, 73 British soldiers lie dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic dig trenches. Loyalists declare the rebellion illegal. Whig radicals toast the glorious Sons of Liberty. In July, the Continental Congress dispatches the Olive Branch Petition, affirming loyalty to the Crown, yet pleading for a negotiated end to bloodshed. George receives it in a Windsor drawing room, still smelling of horse liniment from that morning's ride. He skims the parchment, lips pressed thin, and rejects it out of hand. Reconciliation, he now believes, can only flow through submission. So begins 8 years of war, slogging and slashing from Quebec's ice fields to the fever swamps of Georgia. British generals Howe, Clinton, and Cornwallis trade dispatches in a code as dense as naval knots. George reads every line, writing impossible terrain beside one report, heroic but expensive beside another. Every new casualty list scalds him, both as king and as a man raised to flinch at waist. Sometimes he scribbles private, unsent notes. If only Pitt were still alive, or is victory worth an ocean of debt? But the next morning he dons his uniform and reviews regiments on the grand parade at Hyde Park, steeling them and himself for more sacrifice. In 1777, at Saratoga, General Burgoyne's surrender becomes the hinge of global geopolitics. France, scenting British fragility, officially recognizes American independence and joins the fight. Spain and the Dutch Republic soon follow. The Royal Navy, once unchallenged, now must guard the Channel, blockade American ports, and patrol the Sugar Islands all at once. Insurance premiums on London shipping spike so high, brokers jump from bankrupt balconies. George writes to Lord North that fighting the war has become like trying to smother a forest fire with lace handkerchiefs. North resigns. Pitt the younger, lanky, brittle-brained, just 24, rises behind the Treasury dispatch box like a stripling gladiator. He vows to salvage finances before they crush the realm. Financial salvation will not include America. On September 3, 1783, beneath the frescoed ceilings of the Hotel d'York in Paris, British diplomats sign a treaty that recognizes the United States. When couriers burst into Windsor's crimson drawing room with the news, George removes his spectacles, inhales once, and after a long pause says simply, "It is done." Later that evening, he walks the castle battlements alone. He winds a silver pocket watch, snaps it shut, and mutters something a footman claims sounded like, "Better to lose provinces than principle." Whether he meant the principle of parliamentary sovereignty or the principle of measured kingship is anyone's guess. Perhaps even his. If you believe, though, that the loss of 13 colonies broadcast the death knell of Britain's ambitions. Look again at the pilot charts of 1784. Britannia's ensign crackles over Gibraltar and Minorca in the Mediterranean, over the sugar plantations of Barbados, over the spice warehouses of Madras and Calcutta. When Captain James Cook's charts reach the Admiralty, pointing to a vast southern continent ripe for colonization, the British cabinet dispatches the First Fleet. 11 hulks, loaded with convicts, marines, and livestock, battle 40-foot swell round the Cape of Good Hope and arrive at Botany Bay in January 1788. Bath papers run cartoons of kangaroo-mounted troopers. George, always awake to agricultural novelty, asks whether eucalyptus might thrive in Cornish soil. Meanwhile, steam bellies out of London's skyline. On the banks of the Irwell, the Arkwright mills spin cotton into thread at rates that make weavers blink. George visits one anonymous Tuesday afternoon, ignoring the sooty sneers of Manchester radicals, to quiz an overseer about fly shuttles and water frames. Every other ruler in Europe still treats mechanical innovation as a curiosity. George treats it as statecraft. He offers James Watt a pension, founds the Board of Agriculture, and personally corrects proofs of Arthur Young's essays on field drainage. If he had died in 1785, historians might have labeled him a courteous, science-minded Renaissance monarch who lost one continent but fathered the next wave of industrial power. Unfortunately, mortality seldom chooses the tidy narrative arc. In spring 1788, the king complains of stomach cramps after a dinner of roast goose. 2 days later, he is talking without pause, his sentences leaping from royal finances to the color of Apollo's horses to the best method of brewing nettle beer. Court whisperers recall that Frederick, George's father, also succumbed to sudden ailments. But George's affliction shoots beyond mere pain. His skin flushes deep indigo, his urine darkens to wine purple, and his mouth unleashes torrents of words at a pitch that makes palace watchdogs whine. Physicians debate whether it is inflammation of the brain or corruption of bile. The leading treatment paradigm, purge, bleed, blister, only exacerbates the terror. For weeks, Windsor echoes with shrieks 1 minute and him singing the next. Charlotte, eyes hollow from sleeplessness, confiscates every newspaper to prevent gossip slipping into children's hands. Parliament, constitutionally unable to function amid a mad monarch, staggers toward a regency bill. At last, around Christmas, the symptoms ease. George, voice hoarse, begs forgiveness for any injuries done in my delirium. He turns, astonishingly, to music, ordering the royal band to play God Save the King in the chapel so he can test whether his mind still tracks each chord. The convalescence lasts almost a decade. During that time, Europe explodes again, this time not in dynastic rivalry, but in ideological wildfire called the French Revolution. Louis XVI mounts the scaffold. Robespierre unleashes the terror. Refugees flood English ports, lords in tattered lace begging for bread from London street vendors. George regards events with a mixture of horror and intellectual curiosity. When the National Convention declares war on Britain in 1793, he summons Pitt the Younger and says quietly, "We have lost too much already to lose Europe too." Pitt forms coalitions, loans millions to Austrian and Prussian armies, and slowly strangles French commerce with a naval blockade. French generals, once mocked as lawyers carrying pikes, reforge themselves into professionals under one incandescent Corsican, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1701, as the French consulate consolidates power, George suffers a second major breakdown. This time, the physicians resort to new methods: mild sedation, warm baths, gentle conversation, under the supervision of Francis Willis, an unorthodox Lincolnshire doctor who believes restraint chairs are for the unimaginative. Again the king rallies. Again he governs, but the gleam of assured competence has dulled. When Pitt urges Catholic emancipation to secure Irish loyalty after the Act of Union 1801, George balks, claiming his coronation oath forbids it. Pitt resigns. Addington steps in. The war against France drags on. We approach 1805. British fortunes turn on a crisp October afternoon off Cape Trafalgar. Admiral Nelson, dressed in a threadbare uniform heavy with decoration, signals, "England expects that every man will do his duty." 33 French and Spanish ships of the line buckle under British broadsides. Every cannon roar smacks the horizon like thunder gods waging Armageddon. Victory is shattering, absolute. Nelson dies at the apex of it, and resets naval power for a century. London erupts in weeks-long illumination. Factory whistles in Manchester blow exultant steam. Up at Windsor, George, partially deaf, receives the dispatch in a study filled with botanical sketches. He sets down his magnifying glass over a half-colored lithograph of a Hawaiian orchid and whispers, "The realm is safe." Whether he fully comprehends the strategic enormity of the triumph remains unclear even to Charlotte. The next 5 years eat the marrow out of the king's mind. By late 1810, he seldom recognizes ministers. By early 1811, he mistakes daylight for candlelight. Parliament, reluctantly and with elaborate ceremony, strips him of power and invests it in the Prince of Wales, now Prince Regent. Charlotte, physically fragile from 16 pregnancies and emotionally half-consumed, retreats to Kew with her daughters. The Prince Regent, corpulent, peppered with debts, glittering with diamond buttons, commissions Brighton's exotic royal pavilion, and gambles away enough coin to outfit a small brigade. George III, by contrast, begins each day repeating the Lord's Prayer, then drifts through corridors, greeting portraits by name. Certain old friends have gathered for supper. He can still recite whole pages from Joseph Addison and quote Virgil in the original. Yet by evening he cannot recall whether it is planting season or Advent. July 1814. London stages the Jubilee of Peace, celebrating Napoleon's first abdication. Cannons boom, acrobats spin above Hyde Park, and fountains flow with wine. George spends the night alone, peering out a mullioned window at a fog he mistakes for battlefield gunsmoke. The final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo on June 18, 1815, passes almost without his notice. Some accounts suggest a footman tried to explain the news. George reportedly smiled politely and asked after the health of Lord North, dead these 30 years. Because no sovereign can be impeached for lunacy, Britain simply goes on without him, the monarchy now a ceremonial husk inhabited by a living ghost. Yet, even a ghost can cast shadows that shape the age. The Slave Trade Act of 1807, which George signed with a trembling pen, arms the Royal Navy with a moral mandate to patrol the Atlantic for slavers. Across the British Isles, evangelical reformers hail the crown as ally. Plantation interests curse a meddling monarch. His agricultural initiatives spawn prize herds, better plows, and the first Royal Agricultural Society. His patronage of Edward Jenner saves tens of thousands from smallpox. His personal library, 65,000 volumes on theology, astronomy, botany, even early chemistry, forms the beating heart of what will become the British Library's King's Library Tower. Still there, still golden-backed, still open to the curious. On January 29, 1820, with a winter sun sifting through ice-crusted panes, George III exhales once, twice, and is gone. The newsboys of Fleet Street shout themselves hoarse. Some Londoners weep in genuine grief. Others mutter that at least now the realm knows who actually rules it. Parliament votes him a monument in Windsor. The image of a resolute figure planting an acorn. Inscription: he nurtured the seed. Satirists prefer Gilray's old cartoon of a blundering king tiptoeing through a field of upended tea crates. Historians will forever toggle between these portraits, unsure whether the man was England's Cincinnatus or Britain's Caligula. Perhaps both, by turns. What endures is the silhouette of a monarch who married practical curiosity to antique prerogative, who lost America yet midwifed modern constitutionalism, who financed vaccination but could not inoculate himself against the tempest inside his own brain.